Today we have a special case for you, involving the love of two best friends that turned into murder. It was a calm afternoon on May 7th, 2017, in the small town of Bealier, Ohio. David Kenny, along with his wife Sherry and their young daughter, set out to return a weed trimmer to David's close friend, Brad McGarry. As they approach Brad's house, a sense of unease settles in when no one answers the front door. David leads his family to the back of the house, where they find the service door slightly ajar. Upon entering, they find the house in disarray, with clear signs of a struggle. David decides to check the basement, where he makes a horrifying discovery: Brad's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. David was a young man from a small town where everyone knew each other. He grew up in a tiny house with his parents and two younger sisters. His family didn't have much, but they were close, and they always made do with what they had. David was a good-hearted boy, always willing to help his neighbors and friends. He was quiet and thoughtful, never one to rush into things without considering them first. When David met Sherry, it was at a local diner where she worked as a waitress. She was older than him by a few years and had 3 kids from a previous relationship. Her life hadn't been easy. She had been left to raise her children on her own, and she struggled to make ends meet. But there was something about her that drew David in. Maybe it was her strength, her determination to keep going no matter how tough things got. Or maybe it was the way she smiled at him, like he was the only person in the room. David started coming to the diner more often, sitting at the counter where Sherry served coffee. They would talk for hours when she wasn't too busy, and he found himself falling for her more and more each day. His friends warned him that getting involved with a woman who already had kids would be difficult. They said it would be too much responsibility, that he should find someone his own age, someone without so much baggage. But David didn't care. He loved Sherry and her kids, and he wanted to be part of their lives. After a few months of dating, David proposed to Sherry. They got married in a small ceremony at the local courthouse, with just a few close friends and family members there to witness it. David's parents were a little unsure at first, but they saw how much he loved Sherry, and they welcomed her and the kids into their family with open arms. Life wasn't easy for them. David knew he needed to find a stable job to support his new family, so he took a job as a coal miner. It was tough work, dangerous and exhausting, but it paid enough to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. He went through weeks of training, learning how to handle the machinery, how to stay safe in the mines, and how to work with a team. During his training, David met Brad McGarry. Brad was a rough, around-the-edges type, but he had a good heart. He was older than David, and he'd been working in the mines for years. Brad took David under his wing, showing him the ropes and giving him advice on how to survive the harsh conditions. The two of them became fast friends, almost like brothers. They would hang out after work, sometimes grabbing a beer at the local bar, other times just sitting on the porch talking about life. Brad had a way of making David feel like he wasn't alone in this tough world. He shared stories about his own struggles, about how he had lost his wife to cancer a few years back, and how he had raised his son on his own. Brad's son was older now, off in the city working as a mechanic, but Brad still talked about him all the time. David admired Brad's strength, his ability to keep going despite everything he had been through. The days in the mine were long and grueling. David would come home covered in coal dust, his body aching from the hard labor. But he never complained. He knew he was doing it for his family, and that made it all worth it. Sherry would always have dinner ready for him when he got home, and the kids would run to him, excited to see their new stepdad. Those moments made everything he went through during the day seem small. David and Sherry's life wasn't glamorous, but it was filled with love. They made the best of what they had, always finding ways to support each other. David knew that life would continue to be challenging, but with Sherry by his side and Brad as his friend, he felt ready to face whatever came their way. They were building a life together, one day at a time, and that was all that mattered to him. As the investigation into Brad's death unfolded, the detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the events of that tragic night. The initial shock of discovering Brad's lifeless body in his apartment left everyone in disbelief, especially David, who had been the one to find him. When Sherry, David's wife, made the call to the police, she could barely hold herself together. The thought that something so violent had happened to someone so close to them was unimaginable. The detectives arrived promptly, their presence adding a coldness to the already chilling atmosphere. They carefully examined the crime scene, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. At first, the detectives suspected a robbery gone wrong. However, as they combed through Brad's belongings, they realized that nothing of value had been taken. Brad's wallet, filled with cash and credit cards, was untouched. His expensive watch lay on the dresser, undisturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no open doors. This wasn't a robbery, they concluded. With the robbery theory out of the way, the detectives considered other possibilities. One theory was that it could have been a hate crime. Brad was openly gay, and in a town where such openness was rare, it wasn't unimaginable that someone might have had a problem with it. But as they interviewed Brad's co-workers and neighbors, they were met with stories of admiration. Brad was well-liked, respected even, for his courage to be himself. There wasn't a single person they spoke to who had a bad word to say about him. The case seemed to be leading nowhere until Brad's cousin came forward with a shocking revelation. She told the detectives that Brad had been involved in a secret affair with a married man known only as DJ. The detectives were stunned by this information, and it set off a chain of events that would change the course of the investigation entirely. The first thing the detectives did was to find out who DJ was. They scoured Brad's phone records, looking for any clues. After days of searching, they discovered something unbelievable. DJ was none other than David Kenny, the very man who had found Brad's body and who had been at the center of the investigation from the beginning. But in an entirely different light. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They now had to consider the possibility that David, a man who seemed so distraught over his friend's death, might actually be involved in it. They went back through all their interviews with him, looking for any signs that he might have been hiding something. The detectives dug deeper into David's life. They uncovered the struggles he faced, being married to Sherry and working as a coal miner, trying to support his family. His relationship with Brad had started innocently enough, two friends bonding over shared hardships. But at some point, it had turned into something more, something secret. And that secret had the potential to destroy everything David had built. The investigation took a dramatic turn as the detectives focused on David. They began to question his every move, analyzing his alibi, and looking for any inconsistencies in his story. David, now under intense scrutiny, started to feel the pressure. His once calm and composed demeanor began to crack. The detectives could see it, and they knew they were getting closer to the truth. As they continued to unravel the complex web of lies, secrets, and hidden relationships, the case became more tangled. They discovered that Brad had been planning to reveal the affair, tired of living in secrecy. He had confided in his cousin, telling her that he was going to confront DJ and force him to make a choice: to leave his wife or end the relationship. This ultimatum could have been the motive they were looking for. But the evidence wasn't clear-cut. There were still unanswered questions, and the detectives couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They needed more proof, something concrete that could tie David to the crime. They knew that if they didn't get it right, Brad's killer might walk free. The investigation became a race against time as they worked day and night, driven by the need to find justice for Brad. The twists and turns in the case kept everyone on edge as new information came to light and old assumptions were challenged. It became clear that this was not just a simple case of murder. It was a story of love, betrayal, and the dark consequences of secrets kept hidden for too long. The detectives were determined to see it through, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or complicated it might be. And as they delved deeper into the lives of those involved, they realized that the answers they were looking for were not just about solving a crime, but about understanding the human heart, with all its flaws and vulnerabilities. The investigation into Brad's murder takes a dark and complex turn when the police begin to suspect David. Their first breakthrough comes when they secretly obtain David's phone, hoping to find something that might shed light on his relationship with Brad. What they uncover is far more than they expected. A series of intimate messages and calls between David and Brad that confirm their affair. This revelation not only shocks the detectives, but also paints David in a new, more sinister light. The detectives continue their search for evidence, and soon they find surveillance footage that places David at Brad's house just before the murder. The footage shows David arriving alone, his face partially hidden under a cap, but it's unmistakably him. The time stamps on the video match the approximate time of death, creating a troubling timeline that implicates David even further. As the police analyze the data from David's phone, they find that his device was active at Brad's house during the time of the murder. The location data is irrefutable, placing him at the scene and destroying any alibi he might have tried to construct. With this evidence in hand, the detectives confront David, whose initial shock and denial quickly give way to fear and confusion. David is brought in for questioning, and the police lay out their findings. At first, he tries to deny everything, but the evidence is overwhelming. Cornered, David eventually breaks down and confesses to being at Brad's house that night. However, he claims that the situation escalated into a confrontation, and he was forced to kill Brad in self-defense. He describes a scenario in which Brad became aggressive, threatening to expose their affair to David's wife, Sherry. According to David, in a moment of panic, he fought back, and the encounter ended in Brad's death. But the detectives aren't convinced. David's story is riddled with inconsistencies, and nothing he says matches the forensic evidence. The autopsy reveals that Brad was shot twice in the back of the head, hardly the outcome of a struggle. The cold, execution-style manner of the killing contradicts David's claim of self-defense. It becomes clear that David is hiding something, and the detectives suspect that his motive was much darker than he's willing to admit. As the investigation continues, the pressure on David mounts. His emotional state deteriorates. He becomes increasingly erratic, alternating between tearful remorse and angry outbursts. The police dig deeper into his life, uncovering the stress he was under, his struggling marriage, his demanding job, and the fear of his double life being exposed. These factors, combined with Brad's threat to reveal their affair, create a powerful motive for murder. The case against David quickly escalates, and he is arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The courtroom becomes a stage where the true extent of his guilt is to be determined. The prosecution argues that David killed Brad to keep his affair hidden and to avoid the catastrophic consequences that would follow if Sherry found out. They paint a picture of a man pushed to the edge who saw no other way out but to silence Brad forever. The defense, however, tries to spin the narrative in a different direction. They argue that David acted out of fear and desperation, that Brad's threats left him with no choice but to defend himself. They attempt to downgrade the charge to manslaughter, hoping to garner sympathy for David as a man who was trapped in an impossible situation. But as the trial progresses, it becomes clear that the evidence against David is overwhelming. The prosecution presents the forensic analysis, showing that Brad was killed in a manner that could not be justified by self-defense. Witnesses testified to David's erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder, and the surveillance footage shows his calculated arrival at the crime scene. The emotional toll on everyone involved is palpable. Sherry, sitting in the courtroom, is a figure of shattered trust and disbelief, trying to comprehend how the man she loved could be involved in something so horrific. David, meanwhile, becomes increasingly despondent, his guilt and fear weighing heavily on him as the reality of his situation sets in. As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Each piece of evidence presented by the prosecution further cornered David, stripping away any hope that he might escape the consequences of his actions. The most damning piece of evidence was the autopsy report. It revealed in stark detail that Brad had been shot twice in the back of the head. This cold, deliberate act of violence directly contradicted David's story of self-defense. There was no struggle, no sign that Brad had fought back. The forensic evidence made it clear that Brad had been executed, not killed, in a moment of panic. The courtroom was silent as the details were laid out. The weight of the truth pressed down on everyone. But no one felt it more than David. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor. The reality of what he had done, and the inevitable judgment that was coming, began to sink in. The man who had once been a devoted husband and friend now faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and the arguments from both sides, found probable cause to proceed with the charge of first-degree murder. The seriousness of the crime, combined with the overwhelming evidence, left no room for doubt in the judge's mind. When the bail was set at $1 million, it was clear that David's fate was sealed. His family, already devastated by the revelations of his affair and the murder, could never afford such a sum. The possibility of David being released before the trial was over vanished, leaving him to wait in jail for what seemed like an eternity. As the days passed, David's emotional and mental state deteriorated. Alone in his cell, he was haunted by the choices he had made. The affair with Brad, which had once seemed like an escape from his daily struggles, had now destroyed everything he held dear. He thought about Sherry, the woman who had stood by him through so much, and how he had betrayed her trust in the worst possible way. The love and warmth they had shared were now replaced by cold isolation, and the knowledge that he had shattered her life was unbearable. David's regret was overwhelming. He replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in his mind, wishing he could take back every moment, every decision that led him to this point. But there was no escape from the truth. He had killed Brad, and there was no justification or excuse that could change that. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and as the trial dragged on, it became clear that he was a broken man. The final days of the trial were a blur for David. The prosecution delivered their closing arguments with confidence, laying out the evidence in a way that left little doubt about his guilt. The defense tried to argue for a lesser charge, but the jury's faces were grim and unsympathetic. They had seen enough to know that David was guilty of cold-blooded murder. When the jury returned with a verdict of guilty, David felt his world collapse. The words hit him like a physical blow, and he knew that his life, as he had known it, was over. The judge's voice seemed distant as he pronounced the sentence, and David was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed in despair. In the closing scene of the story, David sits alone in his cell, the walls closing in around him. He has nothing left but his thoughts and the crushing weight of his regrets. He thinks about the family he has lost, the future that has been destroyed, and the life he can never get back. The love and friendships he once cherished are now just painful memories, tainted by his actions. Meanwhile, Sherry is left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The betrayal is almost too much to bear. She grapples with the reality that the man she loved, the man she trusted, is a murderer. The life they built together is gone, replaced by uncertainty and pain. She must now navigate a future without him, dealing with the aftermath of his choices. The story ends on a somber note, leaving everyone to reflect on the consequences of secrets, lies, and the irreversible damage they can cause. David's life is ruined, not just by the crime he committed, but by the choices that led him down a dark path. Sherry, too, must find a way to move forward, her world forever altered by the actions of the man she once believed she knew. But in reality, why didn't David just come out about his homosexuality? Thank you for watching. We have many true crime stories of people who let their obsession become their undoing. Be sure to check them out. So please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of our true crime stories.